I guess I'll start, that was some of the projects that I've been involved with described there, but I think the thing that goes sort of unsaid is that I come from an urban background. I'm born and raised in San Francisco, and although my mom was into gardening, I don't necessarily have a sort of background of being involved in agriculture. And so that informs a lot of what I think in this topic, the idea of democratizing knowledge around agriculture, and specifically the tool of agroecology, is so foreign, to rural people who live necessarily in spaces that have a lot of agriculture, but even more so often for urban folks. And so the projects I started were really about bringing the idea of agriculture as being important, just itself, to urban people by creating spaces for people to encounter agriculture. But also with that, it was very consciously done in a way to engender a feeling of participation and of creation of knowledge, participation in the learning process. So for instance, when I started my first urban farm project, I didn't actually know what I was doing. And I didn't tell people I'm an expert in urban farming. I encouraged us to explore and to learn together through the process of farming. And luckily I had a few mentors who really helped me learn quickly what they actually needed to do. But in this process, of course, urban places have a lot of different kinds of people, and some of those people have more immediate ancestral or generational connections to agriculture that they bring, as well as there's folks who have pretty much essentially forgotten those connections, since we all know that a few generations back, most people were working now. So the different projects, whether it was Alamany Farm, which is an all-volunteer-run farm, still exists in Bernal Heights area of San Francisco. I started and ran some other farm projects in public housing. Also, I'm involved in the Urban Permaculture Institute, which is trying to make permaculture education accessible to people. So for those who are familiar, permaculture is usually a pretty exclusive thing. You got to go away for 2 weeks. It's usually taught in a very hippie, new age fashion. And we try to make that accessible to working people and students in the city. It's completely sliding scale. It's on the evenings and weekends, etc. And so this is all about the notion that this information already exists. We have both academic research on agroecology, as well as we have this embedded knowledge in our communities that we can tease out through having spaces of action, spaces to actually grow food in the urban environment. And so it is inherently about democratizing knowledge and practices around agriculture, and ideally sustainable agriculture, although there's always the challenges of that. When you're authentically working in community, you can't expect everyone to have the same exact opinion about everything. But, so stepping to another project that I think really relates to this intersection of sort of knowledge production, knowledge passing down of knowledge generationally, but also sort of the legitimizing of knowledge. Was a project called, or an effort called Occupy the Farm that I was involved in. And so this was a group that organized because a piece of land owned by the University of California at Berkeley, which had been historically used for agricultural research, was slowly being developed, and then the last remaining 10-acre parcel of this land was under threat of development. And a lot of community members, people who were mostly students, alumni, and some people who were neighbors to the actual parcel of land in Albany, California, they were very concerned about losing this piece of land when for about 15, 20 years, different neighborhood groups, urban ag groups, have been fighting to get access to this land for a community farm. And the idea behind the community farm, of course, is that it would provide a source of education, it would provide a source of healthy organic food. There was all these benefits that people saw from using that land for something other than building a grocery store or a for-profit senior center. So Occupy the Farm, but they essentially took a tactic that no one had tried yet, which was occupying the space itself. Instead of just going through the usual channels of asking the administration for permission or to not develop it as their plans were, about 200 to 300 people actually marched to the site, broke the locks, and entered and planted 10,000 vegetable starts in an area that was to be more genetic corn research. And this story actually is a pretty good one in terms of the effect. It ended up that the university transferred ownership of part of this piece of land from Capital Projects, which is basically the neoliberal development arm of the UC system, to the College of Natural Resources, whose job would be to develop agricultural-related research. And now about an 1.5 acre parcel within that is run as a community university partnership farm, much like the one that was envisioned by community members prior. So it's definitely a story of victory using a very direct action approach that had not been taken before. But besides just the sort of story of victory, the occupation and that effort continues now to this day because the university is now seeking to develop another one of its pieces of land, which is used for agricultural research and develop housing on it, called the Oxford Tract. So if you're in the area and want to participate, that's something to look into. But this brings up questions about what should public land be used for in the first place, right? This was university land. It's owned by the people of California, but it was being used for basic research in corn genetics, which essentially have all applications in biotechnology. And in fact, some of the research being done there, it was traced by an investigative reporter, had been used in patents for biotechnology companies. And essentially, even if it was to remain in that research, it wasn't necessarily serving a public interest, right? And then, of course, once it was paved over and privatized into these individual private companies that would own it, that's even less of a public good being provided. And so the occupation really brought up this question of, well, whose interest should be served by public resources like this public land at a land-grant university? But also not who just has access to sort of use that land and to necessarily learn from that land, in the case of a lot of these educational farm projects, but also who has a right to create knowledge. And how do we go about creating and validating knowledge? Which kinds of knowledge are valued or validated? And in this case, we see often that these public land-grant universities validate, create, and reproduce industrial, agricultural sorts of knowledges, philosophies, approaches. It's actually an underlying assumption to so many things that industrial model is the only one that's worth reproducing. Whereas, as we've all experienced, practitioners, small-scale farmers, indigenous people have forms of traditional ecological knowledge and community-based knowledge that we can't ignore. So, the occupied farm instance also really shows the point, which is that we can't stop just reproducing this knowledge. We actually have to force or pressure institutions to be to be accountable in regards to how they use their resources, which are in fact our resources. And through this, I think that what we're trying to do is engender a feeling of bottom-up power, or an understanding of power that looks at it from the bottom up. Because in all of these processes, while we're talking about specifics around agricultural knowledge, I feel that ultimately we have to be thinking not just about the instrumental outcome of that particular struggle, but conducting that struggle in a way that builds our own sense of power, so that we know that we're moving towards a place where we're making greater and greater demands on public institutions, rather than just being appeased with one or the other victory. And I think in the Occupy the Farm example, clearly we won something in terms of that one research farm, but this isn't about this one piece of land. This is about the role of the research public university in the food system and completely transforming that role. And so we want to conduct these struggles in a way that increase people's levels of demands and the ideas of possibilities of rights and access. So just one last thought, and I'll pass it on, is that I've been doing some research, meaning translating some of these experiences into the academic written form that can help both inform others, but also validate these processes. And I think it's important to remember that the role of the researcher in these kinds of projects is to be active in the struggles that exist, to not passively observe, but to be active in them, to be critical, meaning you can't just engage naively with the movements you work with, but actually be critical of them, but in a compassionate sense, so that you can find gaps or opportunities that aren't being seen. And lastly, importantly, along with that, is to be accountable to those communities and to make sure that in the process of your research, that you're not doing it basically to bolster your own career to the detriment of the people whose work you're basing yours on. So that's it.